a minute until people join in. So we'll start, guys. I'm just a little bit cautious of time and run over. So we'll start now, and we will be recording this session as well, as you mentioned. So we'll be able to send it out, and it will be going up again afterwards. So firstly, thanks very much for everyone dialing in, and good evening to everyone. I hope you are enjoying the session so far and enjoying Talent Summit so far. It's been a brilliant, I suppose, performance from everyone so far, and there's a lot coming on later on this evening as well. So thank you for investing the time with us today. My name is Ryan Malone. I manage the life sciences team with Sigma Recruitment. Today we've an amazing panel lined up, and I'm absolutely privileged to have the opportunity to host these brilliant guests and talk about a very touching and important topic at the moment, which is diversity, equality, and inclusion. We'll be hoping to look at some experiences and stories from the life sciences industry. However, the learnings from today will be applicable to all industries and from a human level as well. So in terms of the main areas we're hoping to cover, we want to look at the importance of diversity, equality, inclusion from both an organizational and a human standpoint. We want to look at how COVID-19 has impacted diversity, equality, and inclusion and the progress so far, and what it will look like as we come out of the pandemic. And finally, we want to look at practical ways and how we can implement strategic and sustainable diversity, equality, and inclusion programs. I hope that everyone today will be able to take some practical learnings from the discussion that we have and apply it to their everyday life and their work life to support both organizational, but more importantly, human growth. So to hop in, I'm going to introduce the panel, and we've an excellent panel lined up, and I'm going to start off with Celeste Warren. Celeste is a world-renowned global leader for diversity and inclusion. She's the Vice President at the Global Diversity and Inclusion Center of Excellence with Merck, where she's responsible for working with global leaders to advance and embed diversity and inclusion throughout the organization. Celeste has had multiple articles on diversity, equity, and inclusion feature at both national and global publications. She's been honored with multiple awards, including Savoy's magazine's Most Influential Women in Corporate America, and is featured on Diversity Woman magazine's Elite 100 list. She's the wife of John Warren and the mother of 2 children, and is dialing in from Pennsylvania. So thanks very much, Celeste. Secondly, I want to introduce Patrice Farrell. Patrice is a talent acquisition manager with AbbVie in Ireland and has a profound interest in diversity, equality, and inclusion. She supported diversity recruitment activities globally in the healthcare and automotive sectors, and has played an instrumental part in AbbVie's global and local success in recent years. The company itself having been awarded the #1 large workplace in recent years, and one of Ireland's best workplace for women for the 2nd year in a row. So they're making real strides in the area of diversity, equality, and inclusion, and Patrice has been instrumental in that as well. Thirdly, I want to introduce Omri Johnson. Omri is a social capitalist, epidemiologist, and executive coach. He's widely recognized as an inclusion, organization effectiveness, and behavioral change leader. He's a former global head of cultural intelligence and inclusion at Novartis, where he fostered the opening of minds and deepening of skill sets with organizational leaders and their employees and people. Omri is currently the CEO and founder of Inclusion Wins, where he's successfully building a people-focused solutions provider, which helps organizations turn their unique distinctions into a competitive advantage. He was born in Kansas in the US. He's worked and lived in Brazil, the US, and is currently living and working in Basel, Switzerland with his wife and 3 kids. And finally, I want to introduce Margaret Martin. Margaret is the HR director at Boston Scientific in Cork. She joined Boston Scientific in 2001, where she had a long, successful career working in HR, specifically within the US-based commercial divisions. Margaret was based in Dallas in the US, however, she's recently relocated to Boston Scientific facility in Cork with her family and hasn't got to experience that true Irish experience yet, but it will come once the pandemic shifts. Margaret has been a fundamental player globally in Boston Scientific's diversity, equality, and inclusion programs. As the HR director, she's led the design and implementation of a women's leadership network to over 1,000 global employees during the pandemic. She's also partnered with Close the Gap, which is Boston Scientific's health equity initiative, and spearheaded multiple other diversity and inclusion programs throughout her career. So firstly, thanks very much to the panel for joining in. I know there's a lot to offer today, and it's a privilege to get the opportunity to sit on the panel with you. So I'm going to open up the panel, and I suppose the first question I'm going to shoot out to the group, and I might start with yourself, Celeste. Simply, I mean, from your perspective, what does diversity, equality, and inclusion mean to you?
Well, very simply, diversity is differences. It's the differences in people, how they identify, their culture, their experiences, their perspectives. And inclusion is basically how you bring all of that together to leverage that diversity to improve, the organization, in my case, the organization, and also the engagement of the people, the culture. Equity, sometimes we know that because of history, because of various different socioeconomic factors, because of a lot of different factors, everyone isn't playing on the same playing field. It's not an equal opportunity for a lot of different reasons. And so equity is the ability and the work that's being done to try to even out that playing field, to try to make it more of an equal work environment where everyone can aspire to achieve whatever it is that their desire is. So I would say that primarily is a simple answer for those three terms.
Patrice, from your perspective, obviously coming from a primarily recruitment background, what does it mean to yourself and from, I suppose, the recruitment and talent acquisition perspective when it comes to diversity, equality, and inclusion?
Yeah, so I think with regards, and I agree with everything that Celeste just said, I think in relation from an organization and company perspective, it's hugely important that you can attract and bring in that diversity of thought, because having that approach where the more differing opinions you have around the table, that's what adds value to your organization. That's what allows the company to grow in the way that you need it to grow. And also each employee and everyone having that sense of belonging, that when they look at the organization, they see and they hear from other people who in some ways have a lot of similarities, but in other ways differ greatly. So when we look at it from a recruitment perspective and from a talent acquisition point of view, it's really important that we're attracting in a diverse slate of talent into the business so that we can help the business then grow through those different opinions. And that's hugely important, I think, for any organization.
Yeah, definitely. Margaret, from your perspective then, I know obviously I was saying you've worked in America and more recently relocated to Ireland. Have you noticed a different perspective on, I suppose, how we look at diversity, equality and inclusion from, say, working in America and to Ireland now?
Yeah, it's a good question, Ryan. It's one I've actually been asked a few times since I've been here. And as I think about it, I guess what I would say around this idea of America, Ireland, or just anywhere in the world, right? I think progress around DE&I isn't specific to one place or one part of the world or an organization. It's really about where your starting point is and where you are currently today. And I think it would be hard to generalize a whole country in one place. And I don't think the space of DE&I is specific to, it's a US-led initiative, right? So I think what you have to look at in terms of where are we on that progress continuum, it's where is your organization today, and being ruthlessly honest about that, right? Because it serves no purpose to try to say, oh, we're at this point in our progress, or we're in this point in our progress, because when you do that, you limit the opportunity. So I think it's about stepping back and saying, where are you as an organization in your DE&I efforts? Because there's places in Ireland where I'm sure they are promoting and doing, and they're further along in their journey than some places in the US. So I think we have to be careful about making generalizations like that, and just recognize where you are in your organization. And like I said, just be honest about where you are. Meet people where they are in their journey, and that's where you start your planning from.
Yeah, no, definitely. I know myself and Omri, when we were chatting, you talked about, and I believe you've published an article on this as well, about how diversity isn't, it's not an endpoint, it's not a destination, but it's more so a journey. And you've kind of explored that with a couple of different organizations throughout your career, correct?
I'm sorry, say that again.
you've kind of explored this, this opinion, or this, I suppose, view that diversity, equality, and inclusion isn't necessarily an endpoint or destination, but it's a journey that's somewhat never-ending. I know we discussed that a little bit more. What's your view on that, from having worked with a couple of different organizations from that perspective?
It's a good question, and thanks, and it's a pleasure to be here with everyone. I think when I think about diversity, where a definition is concerned, I think about a definition from Roosevelt Thomas, who's like a pioneer in this work, and he talks about the mixture of similarities and differences and their respective tensions and complexities. So when you have a group of people that come together, I mean, I have a family of 5, and we have tensions and complexities. That's just the nature of who we are and who humans are. And so when you have that and you bring it into an organization, you need the skills, you need to have kind of behavioral norms, you need to have the ability to adjust. And all those things take work and practice. And so, and it's always changing with the complexities and changes that are going on in the organization. So for me, it's not a destination, because we're always learning and we're always seeing how the work that we do in diversity, equity, and inclusion helps advance the organization in a way directionally that it would like to go, and also discover things that the organization wouldn't be able to discover without that diversity. So that's kind of how I see it. And, you have to be relentless about it. And I think the way Margaret articulated that is spot on. You have to be brutally honest with yourself, and you have to be constantly learning on what works, because it's not cookie cutter. You have to build this into your systems and structures. That's not easy with anything. Inclusion in a way is a system in and of itself, but it doesn't even work unless it integrates with other systems. So I think for me, it's this really understanding the complexity and knowing that your diversity and the distinctions of your people and all the things that they intersect with, lead to better outcomes if you continue to learn and make adjustments on how you do that.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, that's a very interesting point, and it leads on to, I suppose, one of the topics we wanted to cover today, which is the importance of diversity, equality, and inclusion for organizational success as well as human success. And research carried out by Gartner concluded that diversity improves team performance by up to 30%. And similar Harvard Business Reviews found that diverse companies report 19% higher revenue. So I'm sure if you were to go to any execs of a company and say, we can get 19% higher revenue or increase team performance by 30%, they'd bite your hand off for it. So, I mean, the next question, Celeste, I might kind of point at yourself, is why do you think some companies are still slow to embrace diversity, equality, and inclusion, given the statistics that it is beneficial, not only from an organizational standpoint and a revenue standpoint, but from a human perspective and I suppose the well-being of their employees?
I think, it's interesting when you quote the statistics, and there's been a lot of research from that perspective around how if you have diverse teams, it does equate to top business performance, company performance. But I think a lot of folks, a lot of my colleagues, they're heads of diversity inclusion in companies, when they go in with the external data, then the senior leaders say, well, prove that here. What does that mean here? What have you seen here within our company? Because frankly, they care about their own company and their own company surviving. And so I think that's one thing. We have to make sure that we have the data that tells the compelling story that leads to the actions and the changed behaviors. And we have to get into the minds of our business leaders. I think the second thing is one of the obstacles and the barriers when you talk about diversity and inclusion, especially when you talk about it in terms of certain dimensions of diversity like race and ethnicity, it's a tough conversation, I think, for some folks to have. And so you're talking about challenging at times their values, their systems, their beliefs that they grew up with. And so it gets personal from a standpoint. And so when you have those conversations, depending on the country and the historical perspective of that country tells you who are the haves and the have-nots. And every country has that divide. And so when you start having and opening up the dialogue, it's not a comfortable conversation to have. You run into challenges with people feeling guilty. You run into challenges of people feeling like, well, am I being attacked? I didn't do any of that. That was 100 years ago or 150 years ago or 500 years ago. But we have to have some of those uncomfortable conversations in order for us to move forward. And naturally, as human beings, who wants to have an uncomfortable, tense conversation if you don't have to? So we have to get to that point where we're having those conversations, dissecting it, peeling the onion back, and basically getting underneath all of the challenges so we can have it. So, there's a data component, there's a driving the business component, and making sure that you can prove it. And because that's what business leaders want to hear, prove it in my house. And then there's the second personal component of the difficult conversations that people need to have in order for us to move forward.
Yeah, and Margaret, that might kind of lead me on to ask you a quick question. I know when we were chatting previously, you mentioned that that's something you maybe noticed when you moved here, is that them difficult conversations are a little bit more difficult sometimes. In Ireland at times, not to generalize, but you mentioned that, and I know you would have sat in the panel, previous panels, and I suppose had these difficult conversations, and it was part of a lot of your kind of programs you did in Boston, if I'm correct. Have you any advice or any experience or learning experiences from any times doing that?
Yeah, so we did. What you're saying, Celeste, totally resonates with me. Particularly this past spring, right on the heels of George Floyd, what happened with his ruthless murder, is we launched a series, and it was in Minnesota, which is kind of some of the backyard of Boston Scientific. So it really hit home for a lot of folks that live and work in that part of the US. And, so we did go down a very purposeful path, because that's the journey we've been on. We're trying to be very purposeful in what we do and have reason and rationale behind it. But we went down a pathway of holding a series of what we called kind of courageous conversations. I think a lot of organizations did the same thing. I don't think that's necessarily unique to Boston, but we did it, and you went into it. And it was interesting in the conversations leading up to it, as a lot of the leaders were charged with driving those conversations in their organizations. And what you're saying, Celeste, was totally spot on. The leaders would start to really show where their anxiety was around showing that kind of emotional, getting into that emotive space, and they showed their discomfort. And so I remember lots of conversations before they would even have the courageous conversation with their part of the org, just a lot of conversations, going into it, and people just saying, help me, I don't know how to have this conversation. It was, one of my VPs who's Black was kind of peer coaching one of the other VPs, and he goes, this is a human issue. Like, people are saying, I don't feel qualified, right, to speak on this, right? And and his point was, this is a human issue. Just speak to it from your humanity. And I think that helped people get a little more comfortable in that space. I agree with you too, Celeste, just in the broader topic of driving these programs. We have the data that tells us that this is a compelling business proposition. The excuses that get in the way of it, you have to break those down, and you have to use it in language that business leaders understand and resonate. If you're going to go down a DE&I path, you're not going to go down that path without a plan. And so just like you wouldn't launch a new product or kick off a new process in your organization, you've got to have a plan. So I think if you can bring the data with the plan, and you can drive that compelling reason and get people bought into what you're trying to do. But it's an emotive topic. There's no doubt about that. And you kind of got to break that down.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I know, Omri, again, something that you mentioned previously that might somewhat tie into this is, you mentioned that there's always another level of depth when it comes to diversity, equality, and inclusion. It's not always just address the topic. There's always another level of depth you can go into to actually really try and get to the I suppose, the core issue. From that aspect, having difficult conversations, would you say that that's part of that, or is there anything else you could add to that?
Yeah, I think what was said was spot on when Celeste and Margaret talked about this being difficult, but it's often, I think, difficult because you really have to confront your own humanity, and then you have to consider that, am I thinking about my humanity for everyone? And so the conversations that we've seen around racial equity have often been framed as if they're for Black people. And the reality is that racial equity conversations are for everyone, because if equity is inside of that, it's possible that some of the systemic dynamics that are happening around people of color, what we're often hearing now as BIPOC, and in the UK, BAME, et cetera, they are not isolated to these folks that might identify as part of those groups. They impact everybody. Now, obviously, people that have had different levels of being a part of an in-group experience it less, but the impact on their people, if they're part of an organization, is keeping them from contributing at their highest level. And that in and of itself is impactful to your business, and you want to do everything you can to mitigate that. So this isn't, I think it's important to get this clear to folks that anything that we're dealing with around racial equity or equity in the LGBTQ community, equity amongst people that come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, it's something that's impacting everyone, and all of us have to move into it, whether it's feeling uncomfortable or not, because it's impacting the business, and that has to be crystal clear. So the other part of that is, we've been talking about racism as systemic, and we've had lots of dialogue. Now, for me, and the approach that I think a lot of companies are looking at, they're asking themselves, now what? And that now what is, in fact, if racism is systemic and other isms are systemic, then how do we systemically address them throughout the complexity of our organizations, and what lens do we need to have to do that consistently? And that takes work. It doesn't just take work by the executives, it takes work by everyone. Creating the space. I often say inclusion is ability to create space for everybody to make their highest level contribution. Are we creating the space so people can come forward, looking at those systems that they work inside of, and seeing how inclusion and the practices of bringing things so that we can get to these various levels of equity that we're needed for everybody to thrive? How do we get there? And everybody has to be a part of that. And so, you know, one thing I say oftentimes is, when inclusion wins, everyone wins. But if you don't practice it and you don't build the skills to address it systemically in all of your systems, your organizational design, et cetera, you'll probably get to a stuck point. And that's when a lot of people get frustrated, or they start saying it's just cosmetic. But when you see an organization like Merck, who's been at this for a long time with a lot of high level experts internally and bringing in external experts, it's a longitudinal thing, and you have to address it like that. And it's not something that you get to when you're there. This is something that you're constantly refining, sometimes completely deconstructing, so you can create it anew when you see that something's not getting to you to where you want to go.
Yeah, interesting. And I mean, it's a complex topic, as you've mentioned there, and there's lots of different ways to look at it. I mean, an additional level of complexity now is resulted from the COVID-19 pandemic, and we want to kind of discuss how possibly this pandemic has affected diversity, equality, and inclusion in the workplace. And I mean, I might address this to yourself, Patrice. Do you think, or have you noticed at all if the pandemic has slowed down the progress of diversity, equality, and inclusion, or has it changed at all, particularly with yourselves in AbbVie?
Yeah, I don't think it has slowed it down. I think the pandemic has structured in a way with regards to widening out the audience. I think people have potentially more space and time now to actually reflect. And I think that from having a structured ED&I strategy, whether it is your safety strategy, your quality strategy, your culture of your organization, something like the pandemic doesn't necessarily influence it either positively or negatively, because it should be an integral part of what's happening in the organization. I will say, I think what it has forced us to do is have a greater appreciation for family and for allowances with regards from a remote working perspective. So I think it has stretched us to think about inclusion in a different sense, because I think sometimes we can become very, very focused from a diversity perspective on it's about gender, it's about race, and narrow in on those elements, where it's all of that and much more. So I think from an inclusion perspective, what the pandemic has forced is very practical things. And 18 months ago, if you wanted to bring this everybody today together remotely, Ryan, you probably would have got a no from your leaders, right?
Yeah.
So by bringing everybody together and having a far more inclusive and then a broader spectrum, people that couldn't travel that are now able to participate, having this event recorded so that people can participate post-event and learn. I think it has opened our ways to educate and raise awareness that I think are hugely beneficial for any organization. And I think it has stretched us to think more and to connect with our employees on what do they need. So I think people are asking that question more, like, what do you need as an employee? What is going to make the difference for you in order to succeed in your role? And I think we're getting, to Amory's point, a little bit more of that headspace maybe, which has stripped back and allowed us then maybe to move forward at a more accelerated rate. Plus there is so much happening from a global perspective. And I think that has had huge positive impact, I think, for every organization and just culturally for us as a community. And because I think it's far more visible now, I think there's far more discussions happening. And that, you know, we can't move forward, we can't progress in our journey unless those conversations are happening and unless we start becoming far more comfortable in that uncomfortable space, I think.
Yeah, I think definitely with the point you're making around it has to be part of the organization is definitely a good point. And Omri, I know when we talked before, I hope you don't mind me quoting, but you mentioned the phrase that your dad told you before, and that was that a man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still, which stuck with me. I thought it was amazing because you have to build this into the company culture to make sure it lasts. So I mean, from that aspect, have you had any struggles from your side in terms of, Omri, you know, having worked previously with other companies at the moment in trying to get a full buy-in from the full organization at the moment, or is it something that's already ingrained? How does a company help create more of that?
Yeah, I mean, I've worked inside of companies, but I've spent most of my career externally, and in both cases, and depending on where inside of the organization I might be working, there's always people that resist. But oftentimes the resistance comes because we don't spend enough time building what I call the container. So that container is you know, it's dialogic. It's a series of conversations. It's an understanding of your why on an individual level, on a team level, and on an organizational level. And I think we don't, because sometimes we're pushed to try to get numbers. That's been the kind of history of a lot of diversity programs. It's been about representation. We're not even building up the right container to do that in a long-term, longitudinal, very, you know, reflective way so that we can sustain it. And so for me, you know, my dad had a lot of sayings. He was an orator. You can imagine James Earl Jones' voice in my head, but it's my dad because that's how deep his voice was. And so it resonates with me a lot, because if you move people into this space and you don't bring them along to understand how this is impacting them from the perspective of where they sit, the power that they have to make change, what occurs to them, and then how it's impacting even the generations that come after them, including their own family and children, it's going to be hard to convince them because it seems really soft and squishy. And so, you know, the soft and squishy stuff has become like the thing now, but it doesn't necessarily mean it will be sustained. We have a window of opportunity to bring people along that might not have been there and make sure that those that are already there don't begin to say, oh, you were wrong all along, look at what happened and you didn't get it. Versus, hey, we have some opportunity to create something together that we can build into our organizational fabric that can be sustained. And that's, you know, it takes work, but it's work that actually is so beneficial, particularly with the, you know, level of uncertainty that we're facing every day in our organizations in ways that we just could have never imagined, even, I think you said it, Patrice, 18 months ago.
Yeah, and I mean, to expand on that point, and it's a question that actually came in there, and Celeste, I might aim it towards yourself, and that's, I suppose, a lot of people and a lot of the people dialed in here probably want to know, how do we measure success, and what does success look like when it comes to diversity, equality, and inclusion? Because we've established already it's not a destination, it's an ongoing I suppose, battle to try and improve conditions. So how do you measure success, and what do KPIs look like? I mean, you know, Omri, you said to make sure it's just not a numbers game. So could you expand on that, Celeste, maybe from your side and what you think success looks like?
Just a second, there's numbers. but they're not just, it's not just counting the number of people that you put in chairs. So
Yeah.
That's one number, but there's numbers. I just want to make sure I'm a scientist, so I got to say there's numbers. Yeah.
You didn't disappoint, Omri. You didn't disappoint. You're absolutely right. So you have to look at, first and foremost, the foundational elements of diversity is having a diverse workforce. So at the very basic and the foundation is, do you have a diverse workforce? And that's, what it does it mirror in our case in the healthcare industry. It's, does your employee base mirror the diversity in your patient base? That's a business imperative, because if you're not able to understand what is inhibiting certain patients of certain communities from achieving optimal health outcomes, then you are losing business. And so instead of interpreting what you think is happening in their community with that particular patient, you have to have people from that community of that patient on your marketing teams, on your research teams, on your manufacturing teams, on your sales teams that can help to build a holistic strategy. So one of the things is foundationally looking at the diversity of your workforce. And then when you do that, there's also the underlying things in the talent space from the standpoint of what's your retention look like, what's your turnover look like, your hiring and acquisition and all of that. So that's your basic ones. But also from an inclusion standpoint, you need to understand what is getting in the way. What are those obstacles from your truly having an inclusive environment? And so what we do, which I'm sure a lot of the companies do as well, you look at everyone has employee opinion surveys, right, within their organizations. But you have to look at that information, not holistically, not in aggregate, but cut the data by gender, cut it by generations, cut it by levels in the organization, cut it by race, ethnicity, all of that. And look at the data, comparing those in the minority to those in the majority, and see if there's a difference. And then you can really get an understanding of not just the culture holistically of your company, but also how that culture is viewed from various different dimensions of diversity in your organization. And that allows you to see a different picture. Another aspect too is your business performance. When you, for example, in our HIV franchise, our Merck Rainbow Alliance, our LGBTQ employee business resource group, has been working with our HIV franchise to help them to understand how do we better bridge the gap between patients in the LGBTQ community. And so from that standpoint, the HIV franchise is measuring just like they do with their performance, revenue, sales, all of that. So those are just different things that you look at. Your basic representation, yes, you want your workforce to mirror your customer base. And then secondly, you want to make sure that you're surrounding those individuals with a culture of inclusion so they can do their best work and not have to worry about the emotional tax that comes with however they identify and how they're covering for it at work and how they're managing and maneuvering and all of those things that sometimes people feel that they have to do to be successful at work. So those are the things that I would say are just a few of the things you look at. And of course, your business performance, how it has improved from that standpoint. So I think all of those things are important.
Ryan, if I can build off something Celeste there, because I completely agree with you 100% on those elements. And it is showing up more and more in the spaces we play in the med tech sector, where if you want to do business with other companies or other organizations, you have to have addressed these issues. We are seeing more and more in the landscape. When we get an RFP from a healthcare system, they want to know, what are your diversity, inclusion, and equity processes and programs look like? That becomes part of the contracting just to get in the business. So if you want to get the call for your business to win, you better have put some time into this space, because our customers are expecting it of us. And we're seeing that more and more in the healthcare ecosystem.
Yeah, I think you both are spot on. I just want to add to that a bit, is I think I'm seeing more companies start moving towards creating a a global purpose that speaks to this topic almost intrinsically. So this is not the DE&I office set over in HR or wherever it might sit in the organization, isolated from is the business. And so as you see more of that, I think you're starting to measure things inside the business. And Celeste mentioned that. I even think about it down to your organizational design. So how well do people understand strategy and how they fit into strategy? How well do people really understand their role in developing the organizational culture? How well do people understand what gets rewarded around the values that you purport are important to the organization to align with that purpose, et cetera, et cetera. And that being able to start looking at measurements at that level, I think is a place where a lot of companies are pivoting to, including and along with the kind of traditional measurements that we've seen. Those measurements that are core to the business are becoming more important because employees also have BS meters and they're like, is this cosmetic or is this real? And if it's not attached to a P&L or not attached to somebody's bonus or something like that, and it's not being rewarded, even if it's an intrinsic or a non-monetary reward, it's not necessarily going to be understood as something core. And I think companies are clear about that. They're listening to their employees, and we're starting to see this happen more and more because they want this work to be sustainable and not just, cosmetic.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's one of the main things to address, and we discussed this as well, Omri, is how to have a sustainable and true impact and not just a cosmetic impact. And Patrice, I mean, from your side, from a talent acquisition perspective, how can companies, I suppose, improve diversity and inclusion from a talent acquisition perspective in terms of, obviously, you've the likes of unconscious bias in decision making at the hiring stage. So from that early stage of someone's career in a company, have you utilized any, I suppose, specific tools or techniques to help that initial funnel?
And I think, Ryan, it starts long before you get to that stage where it's at the interview piece, because I think for most organizations, it's really focusing in on that application piece and attracting the best person, because ultimately every organization, you want to bring in the best talent. And so from the perspective of what you aspire to as a company, so what your aspiration is, you never want it to be, oh, we have achieved and this is a tick the box. We've just like hit that button, we've hit that metric, we've hit 50% or whatever that percentage, right? It's, as a company, what do we aspire? We aspire to be a more diverse and inclusive workplace. So therefore, how are we going to then open up to make sure that we are attracting the best talent? So how do we look at the talent landscape and say, okay, if we are not seeing a strong representation come from a particular gender, a particular race, or a particular area, then what do we need to do? Because potentially, as a company, we're leaving some of the best talent behind us because we're never even seeing them. So it's really important when you take a step back, because I think a lot of companies can jump to the unconscious bias and what happens at the interview stage. But the thing is, if you haven't attracted the talent earlier, you're never going to get to that point, right? So there's a number of tools. And I actually think at the summit here 2 years ago, I heard about Textio, for example, which helps you script gender neutral job descriptions. It's about your employees telling their stories externally so that the new talent coming into the business can see, okay, there's somebody like me, or I can see what my career path can be in that organization. And it's partnering with the right groups and communities so that you are sourcing and selecting in the widest talent pools that you can possibly hit. And then from there, how do we shortlist? And that's when you step in to ensure things like unconscious bias. And there's a wealth of unconscious bias training. And I think it's really important that that's positioned appropriately, so that's not seen as something negative in the organization. That everybody holds their hands up. Every leader says, I have biases. And that goes back to some of the points Margaret made earlier. It's really important that everybody is in this together. And we all say, okay, we don't know, like we're all learning. And that's part of the process for us. So I think there's a number of steps. There's a structure you need to put in place. There's process you need to put in place. But there's also that running trend throughout it, that it's not one particular step and that step will be changed and that will make a difference. It's that whole framework needs to be right in order then from a strategic perspective to kind of say, okay, well, this is where we are in the journey. And so there's a number of elements, I think, to it.
Yeah, and that kind of leads into that point, and a point just mentioned that Omri had brought up, and Margaret too. And this will probably be the last question. That the time has actually has flown by. So I'll shoot this last question out, and I might direct it at Celeste and then maybe to the rest of the group as well. So I think one of the key questions that we discussed as well as a panel, and that other people want to know, is how do we get buy-in from the whole organization? And we've discussed, obviously there can be a lot of activities happening disjointed around the organization in different groups, and sometimes it can be pushed to a HR issue, and other areas of the business have their own targets or own objectives that this doesn't direct tie into. So Celeste, have you any advice for companies who are facing that challenge, who are struggling to kind of blend it all into one strategy together and get buy-in from the entire organization?
I think, I like to refer to our diversity and inclusion and equity strategy as it has to have a globalization quality. There's the umbrella of what the company stands for, our strategic framework, our compelling purpose around D&I, that is an umbrella for all of our company in all of our markets. And then the localization part comes where, if you have a strategic framework, so what are those areas, 2, 3, 4 areas that the company has as a priority? And then you just say, okay, what does that mean for me in Ireland? What does that mean for me in the UK? What does that mean for my business in Oss, in the Netherlands? That's the question that you have to ask. And so it starts from the top of a commitment from the senior top of the house, senior leaders. What's that strategic framework that is global? But then what is the localization? How do you make it relevant to everyone across the globe, no matter what region that you are in? That's the key. That's the secret sauce, if you will. Because if it isn't relevant locally, they can't connect to the company mission and vision when it comes to diversity and inclusion, then it's not going to work.
Yeah, no, brilliant. And thanks very much for that. I know our Patrice, or Margaret, sorry, even I should say, that's something you were talking about, is trying to tie it in from when you were in America to Ireland, and trying to get the vision all tied in together. So that hits exactly that point. I mean, final question just to put out. I know we've about 3 minutes left, and I'll put this one out to the panel, and feel free to hop in. Are there any final bits of advice you'd give to a company? I suppose real practical advice and tips that you could give to a company who are looking to either improve their D&I efforts and make a more sustainable program or strategy, or companies who are looking to implement new programs or strategies. And I'll leave that one open to the group.
Well, one thing I want to say, and I think it just piggybacking off of Omri and Margaret and Patrice, if we haven't given you an indication that the world is changing, then you are not learning from history. You're not learning from the past 12 months. Those squishy skills that Omri was talking about, the leadership capabilities are evolving. Mm-hmm. And this Generation Z that's coming up, it's even more diverse than the millennial generation, with a lot of different aspects around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And if you can't embrace it as a leadership, as a leader, and really build those capabilities and those skills, then get out of the way, because this generation coming in is going to roll you over.
Yeah, I have some of those in my house, so I definitely get it. I think what I'm hearing from all the panelists is, this work is evolving. The notion of organization as we've known it in the management literature and the leadership kind of constructs that we've had, all those things are in the process of transformation. We're even bringing back so-called older leadership capabilities back into our organizations, like servant leadership and transformational leadership, as kind of central. And if you look at the characteristics of those leadership frameworks, it's all the kind of words that we've been talking about today. So I'd say you have to make this a priority, not because it's DE&I. You have to make it a priority because it's central to your business success at long term, and just keep learning. If you're not constantly in the process of revisiting whether this work is getting you to where you want to be at any particular point in time, you're probably missing the whole point. This is like any other business priority. You're constantly looking at it. You're looking at the data. You're deciding what you want to keep, let go, and do more of. or less of, and that's central, as just keep learning, keep growing, keep asking the questions that and listening, asking the questions that you probably haven't asked, and listening to those people that you know, you might not have listened to as much in the past, and making sure that their voices are clear.
And I think that's really important. This is a journey. I think this isn't, and if there's anything to take away from today's session and happening with this group, is it is a journey. There's no, and you and your organization will be at some point in that journey. And you need to be okay with where you are. You need to be open and honest where you are and what you want to aspire to be, and have a very clear path forward. And adjust as you need to, because times will change, pandemics will hit, and different scenarios will happen, and that will cause you to adjust, and that you will have to. But don't just go, okay, right, well, this is where we're going to be at the end of 2022. This is what we want to come, and then we're done. Like, this is part of our lives. This is not something that's one and done situation.
This is Ryan, about not thinking, if you took nothing away from today, it's about thinking about DE&I not in a context of it's a standalone thing. Mm-hmm. It's another thing that the company does. It is embedded into what we do every day, like Anne-Marie said, in any other business strategy you would have. And you asked at the beginning of the session, what's diversity mean? To me, it means winning. Because when you do this and you do this well, in the high competitive landscape we're in for talent, winning means you're getting the best talent where they're bringing their whole self to work, and then you can win in the spaces you can compete in. And those were kind of the things that we heard all throughout the panel today. So I thanks for the time, and I really appreciate the panelists' insight. I learned a lot from you guys today.
Yeah, no, thank you. And look, to wrap up, diversity means winning, and inclusion always wins. So thanks very much for joining. I'm sure everyone dialed in got plenty from it, and I appreciate your time. I know we're all very busy at the current time. So thanks so much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.